After having looked at the crappy way that my furnace was put in, I can certainly understand why companies keep getting hacked. It must be just a horrible thing when you consistently fail.
How the hell did I set that up? Yeah, I'm going to turn that shit off. Shall we?
Let's go. Today is Monday, June 30th, 2014. This is episode 74 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and as always, joining me tonight is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Good evening, Jerry. Good evening, faithful listener.
Good evening. And just a reminder that the thoughts and opinions we express on this podcast are ours and do not represent those of our respective employers. So, the first thing I have tonight is just a very brief word of advice from Bob, who was really busy on a incident response engagement. Bob wanted me to pass on that antivirus companies don't always know if a file that you're submitting to them is definitely a virus or not. And so if you submit something that you suspect may be involved in a piece of malware, just because they come back and give you the thumbs down doesn't necessarily mean that it actually wasn't. And apparently Bob is working on a case where one antivirus company accepted this, and they actually had this Bob's customer had a agreement with a large antivirus company who happened to have the same name as some other crazy person, and said that it was not a virus. And several weeks later, it turned out that in fact it was a virus.
Oops.
Or let me be very clear here, right? It was not malware unto itself. It was a component of a larger piece of malware, which by the way, and that I think. What do you mean?
What do you mean by component? Like a dropper or like a?
No, like a driver. So think about a network, a driver that some malware inserts into the network stack, and then uses to intercept command and control traffic and that sort of thing.
Well, it's interesting. Like, how would you know, right? Let's say you are random AV vendor, or even let's say you throw it at against, like a FireEye or some other sandboxing technology. I think they would all fail on that. How would you know, right? It's not something you can detonate easy. It's not something you can easily, unless you start decompiling it and really looking at it.
And even then, it may not. I think the particular problem, as I understood it from Bob here, is that this didn't actually have any necessarily obviously malicious components to it. It served a specific purpose and basically accepted commands, like any other DLL kind of a deal would. And so because of that, I think that's why it wasn't detected as malicious, because by itself it really, I guess, isn't malicious. However, its purpose for being was in supporting some other piece of malicious code. So, I think that the problem here, or what Bob Worley was trying to impress on me, was that malware is getting more complicated, and they often are not just one file. And so, if you find something that, let's say, is a driver causing your system some problems, and you don't think it should be there, and your antivirus company comes back and says that it's benign, that shouldn't be taken as a sign that it's all clear. There is possibly more work to be done. So
yeah, that's it goes back to that false sense of security, and yeah, it's interesting.
Yep. So anyhow, let's get into stories. Our first story tonight comes from CSO Online.
Before we do, we should tease the audience.
Oh yes. Let's do. So we have a listener mailbag episode coming up later.
Right. We're going to the questions.
Yes.
And I'll tell you right now, I'm not sure we're going to be good at answering them, but we're going to try.
I mean, let's be clear. It's not going to stop us. I mean, our ignorance is not going to stop us from providing answers.
Truer words have yet ever been spoken on this show. So stay tuned. After stories, mail from the listeners.
That's right.
We have no fancy bumper music, but it does tell you should write us with questions, comments, praises, complaints, threats.
Sometimes they'll get read.
You can even make us benefactors of your will, whatever makes you happy.
That's right.
All right, sorry. On to stories.
On to stories. So, CSO Online, the title is Airport Breach, a sign for IT industry to think security, not money. Where to begin with? So let me just kind of run through the story and maybe you can pick up some of the craziness.
Yeah, I'm gonna be wrapping my head in duct tape while you do this.
Okay, so 2 airports, and you gotta. It would be helpful if you get a piece of paper and a pen to follow along because this is gonna get crazy, right? So 2 airports were compromised by unknown hackers. The airports were not identified. Okay, and the point of this article is that there's a need. This kind of points to a need for increased focus on national security and less on money. All of us money grubbing security people should come over and do the benevolent thing. But okay, let's keep moving on. So CIS, who is the Center for Internet Security, actually said that in 2013 there were APT attacks on 4 airports, but then later they said that it was actually 8 airports. But then later, they said it was actually 75 airports. So, I guess it was 75.
Well, for a while there, they had 2, 4, 8. They were going quite, good exponential growth. Then they jumped to 75 and completely destroyed the whole pattern.
Right. I would have thought maybe 64.
Yeah,
or
something.
Or 128 would have been a good number. But They went from 8 to 75 and screwed it all up. So the author here, or actually not the author, but this person named Murray Jennings, who's a professor at San Diego State University. And I never understood how San Diego was a state, but that's neither here nor there. Yes, bad joke on a Monday. So I guess the point here, Murray is trying to make is that there's not a lot of financial incentive behind attacking an airport. And so the motives, if you negate that it's financial, are basically probably strategic, right? So whoever's attacking this is doing it to gain an upper hand in the event of some kind of war or conflict, to be able to maybe shut down the airports. And apparently there's 75 of them, I guess. And the method of infection apparently was a good old spear phishing emails where the victims were culled from some kind of public document related to aviation. The document itself wasn't named. What the actual attack did or didn't do wasn't described.
So far, this is a really informative article.
It's terribly informative. However, the net of the article is that yes, us money grubbing bastards should come over and work in the national security world, and instead of trying to make the internet cheaper and faster. But I think to me, some of the problem I had with this, obviously, other than the crazy problem with numbers, is Murray says to help defend against such attacks, people need to be educated on the signs that an email might be malicious. And I think the problem is, that's kind of yesterday's advice.
1997 called. Their InfoSec plan
Right.
is, looking for a way home.
It's becoming increasingly difficult to do that. And I think that security people have to come to the realization. And by the way, this sucks, right? This is not a great thing. It is really difficult. It's becoming increasingly hard to tell, a population of people, even sometimes technically literate people, what to look for, because, these things are, the adversaries here are becoming so well refined in their tactics.
All right. Where should I start?
Have at it.
First off, I agree wholeheartedly with your point. If user education in a vacuum worked, we would not be at the place we're at today. We've been trying user education for years and years and years and years. Am I saying user education isn't valuable? There's a part of me that thinks it's a failed attempt. I think that user education as one piece of a much more comprehensive strategy that includes a lot of technical controls is helpful. But if you're dependent fully upon user education, yeah, you're in serious trouble. So, couple of thoughts. First off, let me ask you something, Jerry. Do you know, just in general day-to-day life, when you meet a pilot?
Yes, I do.
And what would that be?
Because they tell me.
That's right. So, as a pilot, I can tell you that concrete doesn't stop working when a computer is down. So, if their thought is a strategic plan to take out airports in some sort of conflict, about the only really thing that is vulnerable that would really hurt an airport is probably local radar, center radar, departure and approach radar, and the systems that trade information about flights between those various ATC facilities. Otherwise, as long as radio is up and working, those airports can function. Radar is probably the most vulnerable thing. So, mind you, nothing in here talks about them going after radars or shutting down radars. But just as an aside, if I were doing a threat analysis against a airport infrastructure, I'd be looking at radar and I would be looking at inter-ATC communications. Both of which, by the way, have backup plans. So everything else is basically 50s era's technology and really tough to shut down via a quote-unquote cyber attack.
You know what I bet it is?
Please tell me.
I bet you it's the train.
It could be the train. You shut down a big... Yeah.
Think about in Atlanta, if that train shuts down and you got to walk all the way from the terminal to, Concourse D. It's not.
Of course, we have no idea the size of these airports, right? They could be international airports, they could be regional airports, they could be little tiny local airports.
Exactly.
I'm assuming if they have an IT infrastructure of some variety, they're probably at least medium sized. We don't know. Is this, airline infrastructure? Is this FAA infrastructure? Who is this? We don't know.
Yeah, is it a control tower or is it the baggage claim?
Right. We have no idea.
We got no idea.
So, not to just keep harping on what we don't know, but the other point I want to get into is the underlying implication of this article is offensive to me. That if money is your motivator in this industry, then you cannot be secure. That you cannot possibly be motivated by any sort of defensive mindset. Right? That's like saying, cops really shouldn't be paid. They should just want to protect their neighborhood. I'm offended by that. I think it's wrong. And this, by the way, is the thought process of an academic. And I'm going to say this, and it's going to be controversial. Every time I have worked with pure academics, they do not understand real-world security. They understand their lab. They understand the theory. They may know TCP/IP better than I do, but they don't understand what happens when you put that stuff out in the real world. And they get it wrong time and time again. So pure academics, I love you, but you don't know what the hell you're talking about when it comes to real-world security. And send me the hate mail. I'm ready for it. The other thing I would challenge in this report is the concept of there's no money to be made going after airport infrastructure. That is completely false. That is the same mindset that companies have of, well, we've got nothing, that a hacker would want, so we don't need to deploy information security technologies. Complete BS. Anything from just the the employee data is valuable. You have no idea. There are so many APTs out. Well, I shouldn't use APTs. There's so many various attacks out there that are widespread and random that will spread to whatever they can find that's vulnerable. That airport could have been targeted. It could have been complete happenstance. But to say that there's nothing here of value for a hacker, therefore it must be a nation state with a strategic objective, I think is complete conjecture and not a rational conclusion.
Yeah, and I mean, there's nothing at an airport that accepts credit cards, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. My last point is that, these guys, okay, CIS, right? I've had friends work for CIS, and I know a little bit about them, but they're a government-endorsed nonprofit, right? And in essence, my fundamental message here is that they have this holier-than-thou attitude in this article about, we have this altruistic notion of national security, and we're not mercenaries going for the money. I'd say get off your high horse. In general, the government or government-run entities suck at doing almost anything IT related. The private sector is leaps and bounds ahead of them. So if they're trying to say that the private sector, which is money motivated, isn't capable of keeping up with these attacks, I completely disagree with that notion.
And just to be clear, I'm not convinced that it's actually CIS that is saying that. I think it's that professor from
you might be right.
San Diego State.
Yeah,
I think the report about the 75 affected airports came from CIS. So
you threw this article in here just to get me off on a rant.
Well, see, I knew it sits at the nexus of all the things you care about. Airplanes and hacking and your libertarian leanings. So yeah, I knew it was going to get you going.
Good.
Yeah. All right. So, so let's move on. Our next story comes from Wired, and the topic is hospital networks are leaking data, leaving critical devices vulnerable. And this is where you need that dun 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 sound, which
we need to steal the song, the various audio bumps from SVU Law and Order.
Yeah. Yes. Something. I mean, jeez.
If it wouldn't get us sued, we'd be all over that. Oh, and if we had an audio engineer.
Yeah, I got to get on that.
Can't you force one of your children into that role? I mean, they are your minions, aren't they?
They're not very good minions.
No.
You
need more wolves.
Exactly. So the story here, it's a pretty long story, but basically what a couple of researchers who presented a report at ShakaCon was related to hospitals having some systems connected to the internet, and essentially being discoverable. So you could probe these systems and essentially map out the network's innards by looking at querying SMB and getting a map of host names and whatnot. And the problem they point out is those host names are often quite descriptive about what they are. It's the defibrillator in operating room 2, or the PC in some cardiologist's room, and that sort of thing. And the point, they go farther and say that once you get into the hospital network, it's kind of all chaotic too, because there's lots of these medical devices which are not by themselves very secure. So you have pumps, medicine pumps. I think they call it infusion pumps, in fact, that can be controlled by the network, and there's no authentication, and they're relatively easy if you're able to get to them to muck with. And there are Bluetooth controlled defibrillators, which are conceivably not a great thing to be able to control either. And so their point is that all of this stuff kind of aggregated together creates kind of a bad situation where these systems that are sitting out on the internet, providing kind of a window into the hospital, could itself be hacked. And they go on actually say that a number of these systems are vulnerable to Conficker. And by the way, if they're vulnerable to Conficker, I don't know how they're not infected with Conficker, because last I checked, it was like 10 minutes before a system on the internet would get infected. So
I was thinking about that, just to pop in here real quick.
Sure.
What they're saying is the machine that is exposing this SMB enumeration is easily accessible, but perhaps the machines on the inside are not as easily accessible for Conficker to just nail them.
Well, I think you're right. You're spot on. But if this system is out on the internet and that's the one they're polling and querying this data from, and it is vulnerable to Conficker, it's unless there's
just a matter of moments.
Exactly. Yeah. So there must be more to the story on things being filtered out, or there's IPS or something. There's something going on there. There's a little more to the story that I don't quite have. But be that as it may, point is, you got this system that really has no business being exposed to the internet, presenting a very real possibility of being a pivot point into the organization. And once somebody's in there, if they have the desire to do bad stuff, there's kind of the sky is the limit. The other thing they point out is that this just creates, even without that pivot point concept, it creates a very handy map for an attacker to create some packaged malware that could be delivered via phishing email. And it's just not a great situation. And they point out that their research focused on just a couple of hospitals, but in looking around the world, they found that this is a pretty common problem, and it kind of syncs with many of the reports we keep reading about healthcare companies in general not being very sophisticated when it comes to security. So it's just a very disappointing kind of a situation, and I think it comes back to the point that hospitals are very focused on one thing, right? And that's delivering care. They are the networks and whatnot are very, very utilitarian, and we see that time and time again with these breaches. That pop up. The most recent one with those two hospitals that got fined the record HIPAA penalty. A doctor set up a server there, and we never found out much more about that. But it's obvious that hospitals view IT as very, very utilitarian. It's a cost of doing business that has to be minimized. They don't put a lot of thought or effort into securing it, and it's sooner or later it's going to become a real problem for them.
Yeah, I would agree. It's there's so many basics that they're missing here, and I think it's important.
And I think awareness is probably the first step. So this is I think this is a good thing to shine the light on, and we'll see where it goes. And obviously, if you work for a hospital, Shodan is your friend. Figure out where you're exposed, and this stuff isn't complicated, and there's lots and lots of resources available.
Just a good pen test / vulnerability assessment wouldn't cover a ton of this stuff.
Absolutely. Definitely. All right, so moving on, our next and actually last story comes from Ars Technica. And there's actually a couple of different articles from Ars about this. There was a new industrial control APT-like thing called Havix or Dragonfly or about a half a dozen other names. And, I guess it's not really son of Stuxnet because we already had, the son of Stuxnet. So I guess this is like the grandchildren of Stuxnet.
I would say it's Stuxnet's son's brother's cousin's roommate.
Maybe it's a nephew.
Could be.
Yeah. Well, or like you said, it could be farther removed. But in any event,
I just wanted to make a Spaceballs reference. Yes. But that's fine. You can shoot it down.
That's okay. That's okay. I got to watch that movie again. I'm really disappointed there wasn't a second one, by the way. But anyhow, so to me, the attack itself isn't all that interesting. I mean, yeah, these things are pretty narrow in their focus, right? And yes, it's obviously a potentially damaging thing in that this conceivably opened up these electrical utilities and whatnot to espionage and the specter of sabotage. It's not very clear that they could have done that or not. But what's acutely interesting to me is the way they distributed the malware. And so this malware was actually distributed by the attackers compromising the websites, the download sites of some legitimate software providers that provided specific software for industrial control systems. So there were 3 different providers, and each one of them had their website compromised, and the software available for download was replaced with a repackaged version that included this relatively sophisticated malware. And the thinking, to me, the really interesting question becomes, how do you even defend against that?
And that is a tough one. This is nasty. But I had a couple thoughts. Back in the olden days, if you were sort of like a hardcore uber nerd, you used to compare MD5 hashes of what you downloaded and what was posted as the safe MD5 hash. Now, the problem with this philosophy is that, one, who the hell has time for that today, especially in the age of automatic updates, which we like? And second, if I'm a really sophisticated bad guy and I own your website, I bet that MD5 hash is probably on the website somewhere.
Exactly.
I can go alter it there. I mean, the MD5 hashes were more about making sure you didn't have a corrupted download.
Right.
So that's a tough one. Let's say you've got whitelisting software, but you trust an updater, as a lot of whitelisting software can do, right? Like, for instance, to make my administrative headache not too heavy, I can say anything coming from that updater for Adobe, I automatically trust anything that updater gives me. Well, you're screwed there because it's coming from the valid repository.
Right. Or if it's the first time you've installed it, you're going to profile your whitelisting based on what was just installed because you downloaded it from the, quote, official safe repository.
So what this leaves me with in my mind is, once again, going back to ignore the vector. The vector is irrelevant, and assume you will be hacked. And how do you set up monitoring and alerting mechanisms to find the activity of that malware? It's the only thing I can go with.
Yeah, I mean, there is I guess one step farther you can go, which I think is probably still surmountable, and that's actually adopting a signing strategy. Where you have the software is signed, but even that I don't think is that. If you've got an advanced attacker, I don't think that's that big of a problem.
Yeah, it's not a bad thought though. And the other thought that I also had was, if you are employing some sort of automatic sandboxing detonation technology, a la FireEye or competitors, it's possible that when you go to download this, it's automatically grabbed and profiled and may come up as malicious in that profile of that detonation, depending. And then you're really in for a loop, because then you're saying, well, wait a minute, this is legitimate software from abc.com.
Yep.
So how do I, then it's really interesting. So I think the key takeaway here is that you've got to be careful what you trust. It goes back to a conversation we've had on many, many shows. What do you trust and why? What are your trust assumptions, and are they valid?
Right. And I think if anything, this points out that you can't implicitly trust the vendors, the authoritative repository of software.
But that makes your job so damn difficult.
But you said it earlier, right? You have to focus, you've got to focus less on the unobtainable goal of perfect protection, because it's not going to be there.
Right.
You've got to mix in some ability to detect when things go wrong. This is probably not a really common kind of attack vector. Maybe it will become more common. Don't really know. But if you have good, as you pointed out, if you've got good ancillary controls to detect things that are amiss, you may very well be able to. But then again, there's not a whole lot of detail yet about actually how this thing communicates out to the world, right? So we don't know necessarily if it's something that would be also really hard to detect.
Yeah, in essence, this is a watering hole attack, is what it really is.
Absolutely.
And but like you said, it could be a pocket case, but it's good to be aware of these and keep an eye on them.
Yep. And that was why I thought this was interesting, not to go on to the to the big APT fluff fest that everybody is right now, but I thought the method of attack was much more interesting to me. So now is our our listener mail. So I guess insert your own imagined bumper music here, and we'll get into it. So the first thing we have is a follow up from one of our readers. Actually, a couple of our readers followed up when we talked about the IPMI or the BMC controllers. I think there were 2 or 3 different episodes where we've talked about these, and I am pretty sure I or you or both of us kind of railed on how hard is this to keep under control, and apparently it can be kind of difficult sometimes. And in the case of Supermicro's pointed out to us, Supermicro's motherboards usually do have a dedicated BMC or IPMI port. However, if for whatever reason when the system is booted there isn't a link, the link state isn't detected on that management interface, the IPMI multiplexes over to the main Ethernet interface.
That's so wrong.
And we'll try to retrieve a DHCP address, and and apparently you can't disable that behavior.
Oh.
So
it hurts my soul.
So I wanted to talk about a couple of ideas I had to handle that, and the first one would be don't offer DHCP on your server network, or if you do, go strictly reservations.
Or if you do and you have reservations, have a firewall that controls the traffic that comes in and out per IP.
Well, so I was thinking about that too, and there's still a problem of lateral movement within within the subnet.
Okay. Not that it's a perfect solution, but certain switches can be configured.
MAC filtering, yes.
Yes.
I
to not allow lateral movement.
Yep.
I don't trust it. It's not perfect, but it's one more barrier.
Right. And I think for the ultimate in inconvenience, I think usually the way the MAC filtering is enforced is by dropping the link state.
That's true. Although, actually, I'm thinking of something slightly different than MAC filtering. I'm thinking actually of, even if it is on the switch and a valid port and a valid MAC, not letting multiple, ports talk to each other, which actually is kind of breaking the convention of what a switch should be.
Right.
But I have seen that technology.
Right. Yeah.
But first and foremost is understanding if your server hardware has this functionality and if it's up and running.
Yeah, exactly right. But it's interesting because there was I think one of the reports in the wake of that most recent Supermicro IPMI problem, somebody did a scan of the internet and found, I think it was 32,000 systems that you basically could trivially retrieve the administrator password for that not the administrative password for the server itself, but for the IPMI interface.
Which should give you like the ability to power things down.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it's non-trivial.
No, absolutely not. And usually, I think a lot of times that you can do KVM kind of access with them too. So it's definitely not a great thing. But I got to thinking, well, how in the world can you have 32,000 of these things connected? And that kind of makes sense if you just sit them on a network that's wide open to the internet, and you've got DHCP available. It's just gonna get an address.
Yeah, assuming no NAT or anything.
Right. And
the other thing I would say is very basic. Go to the BIOS, see if you can shut this damn thing off.
Yeah. I read some of the forums that one of the listeners pointed us to, and it doesn't look like you can.
I understand I'm sounding like a grumpy old man. Turn the damn thing off. But end of the day, you are responsible for what's running on your gear.
Right.
Even if the manufacturer throws it out there and doesn't tell you and is completely stupid about it, I get that. But it's still on us as the admins to know it and deal with it.
Yep. Yeah, I don't disagree with that completely. So
I will say, I normally don't drink during the podcast. This daiquiri is kicking my ass, so I apologize. It's last day of the quarter. It's been a Monday. I needed a drink.
That's okay. It's all right. It's all right.
Yeah. All right.
Take a breath.
You're normally the tipsy one.
I know, and I'm not. So our next question is: how would one handle a situation where the business has accepted a risk and not listening to the counsel or advice given by the CISO? This is a tough one.
It is a tough one. Although I do have some thoughts, but you first.
All right. So, first thing I'll say is a lot of companies handle this situation by keeping email and meeting minutes.
Okay. All right. Yes. But I'm going to go with the intent of the question is not CYA.
Right. I agree. And that was a funny one, right? So,
yes. Sorry.
So, I think part of it depends on the level of importance of the advice that's not being accepted. Is it that they are being just overly risky and you disagree with their, the philosophy, or are they breaking the law? There are different shades of gray.
It's a good point.
And, I think, but I think at the end of the day, I guess the other point I had written down was, if you've got somebody like that board member in Australia who doesn't see the ROI in information security, it doesn't really matter. You're not going to convince them. But the other thing I'll say is, if you are a CISO, and I guess depending on where the CISO sits within your organization, the expectation is that you are part of the senior leadership team and you are part of, the decision making group, and it is incumbent on you to, state your case. And the business may make decisions that aren't the most sensible from from any kind of perspective, right? At any time, it might not be the best marketing decision. It might not be the best product development decision. It might not be the best acquisition decision. But at the end of the day, after the senior leadership team has made a decision, it's your job to kind of, put your oars in the water and row. And the other thing I'll say is, if you do that, and you get some political capital, as they say, and when something more important comes along the line, and you do say this is a really bad idea, and you're seen as a team player, that you may have a better time convincing them of whatever problem you're seeing. So what do you think?
Yeah. So I had a couple notes here on this, and first off, in my mind, the way this question was asked is, hey, I see this risk. I've warned about it. I've talked about it. I've escalated it. Ultimately, the business has chosen not to mitigate this risk to what I think is an acceptable level. Mm-hmm. So what do I do? First thing I would say is plan for a breach. Expect it to happen. And with that expectation, what are you going to do? How do you get a response plan ready? How do you plan that response plan out? How do you have something that makes it look like, yep, I was ready for this? Not as an I told you so moment, but just, hey, you want to go driving 120 miles an hour? You're probably going to hit the wall. I've got a triage plan ready to go. In that, you need to understand what the most likely avenue of attack is, what the most likely risk is based on what you're warning about, right? You're saying, hey, we don't have, I'm going to make something up here. We don't have a web application firewall in front of our website. Our website is riddled with cross-site scripting and buffer overflows and all sorts of SQL injections. Somebody's going to own our website. So then what I would start doing is, once I've identified what the most likely problem is going to be, is build a monitoring platform in some way around that problem so I know about it as quickly as I possibly can, and I have a remediation plan in place. And from that, I figure out what my most likely attack is going to be, what my most important data is, figure out a response plan, and then start prioritizing what my most important data is, second most, third most, fourth most, and have a plan in place. Second thing I would say is continue to preach the cause. Don't give up. Don't be the boy who cried wolf. But a lot of times I've seen executives say no 100 times before they say yes. And so without eroding your own credibility and without eroding your own ability to have influence, continue to bring this up on a regular basis as appropriate to the culture of your organization. And eventually it may bubble up to the point where they will do something. You don't know all the things that executive is balancing in terms of the issues on their plate. You don't know why they're making that decision. There could be other bigger issues. They're trying to keep the company just as a going viable concern that week. And the situation may change a quarter from now.
That's a really great point. It's a really great point.
And the other thing I would say is, and this is something I sucked at so badly in my career. So if anybody's listening who I used to work with in the past, let me just say I'm sorry I was such a dick to work with, because I always thought being right was the only thing that mattered. That is such a short-term mentality. And we do this in InfoSec all the time. We do this in IT all the time. I'm right, so I don't have to be nice. I'm right about this. You're wrong. Get your shit straight. I don't need to deal with you. That is not effective in business. So what I would say is, don't learn to lead from a position. Your position does not give you power. Your influence, your credibility, your ability to communicate is what gives you power in an organization. And this is something that I kind of came into later as a realization in life. I got away with being very difficult to work with for a long time because I was good enough to get away with it. But as soon as I stumbled, I had a lot of people who would jump all over me. And the problem is with that is it's not about being nice and making everybody, but they have to at least respect. They have to at least acknowledge that you're not really difficult to work with and you've got the right ideas in mind. And it's not ego-driven. So, what I would say is if you're in an InfoSec leadership position, one of the key skill sets you've got to learn is communication and leading from influence.
Well said.
It's difficult. Yeah, it's difficult. And I'll throw one other thing out here on this. One thing that I've I try to do a decent amount about is read about business, and in part because I always wanted to run my own company, and I'm pushing 40 now. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but I've always been really interested in entrepreneurship and leading and running my own gig. It's part of what got me into sales engineering out of just pure IT operations. And one source for a lot of good information that I found recently is a guy by the name of Dave Ramsey. He's well known for his anti-debt personal financial advice, but he also has a second brand, if you will, called Entre Leadership. And there's an Entre Leadership podcast, which is all about business, all about leadership. Highly recommended. So go check it out. Anyway, but that comes back into understanding how to communicate, understanding how to prioritize, understanding how to get that. So those are my thoughts. What do you think?
Awesome.
Okay.
I think you need to have daiquiris more often.
Fair enough.
So,
by the way, this is a lot easier to say than it is to do.
Yeah. Well, hopefully somebody will get some inspiration out of it. So our next question is, what is the cheapest security solution or approach that you see organizations failing to implement, and what is the most cost-effective security solution or approach that you see organizations failing to implement? So, to me, this is a really tough one, but I would say, and this is going to come out of left field, educating IT staff about threats and hacker methods is probably one of the most cost-effective, in my mind at least, the most cost-effective things you could be doing. And then after that, it's probably hardware and software inventory management. What do you think?
Cheapest, automated patching. Keep your stuff up to date.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, just as simple as, assuming you're not a very diverse, complicated shop, but for your Windows boxes, just have them patch all the time, please. Most cost-effective.
Remove Java?
This is a tough question, right? Because what does cost-effective mean? I read this as what is the most effective. I would say true whitelisting technology, a la a Bit9 or a Solid Core or others. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I'll say on this one, and this could develop into a longer rant, and this is something Jerry and I were talking about before the show, is I think one of the most cost-effective is not overworking your team. The problem with InfoSec is it can be completely interrupt-driven and completely reactive. I have a big problem with that, because to really be good at InfoSec, you need a lot of spare time to think, to understand the interrelations of different things, to really dig into big, hairy problems and figure out how to secure them. If your InfoSec team is just reacting to incidents and reacting to whatever the fire drill of the day is, they are missing the big picture. They're being very tactical and they're not being strategic. To be strategic, you've got to get out of the rat race of day-by-day InfoSec. You've got to have time to think about, that lab box might actually have a connection over to this database server that actually has a connection to this DMZ. I should go look at that. You can't do that if you're stuck in tactical day-by-day firefighting.
Yep, absolutely. So
have Slack on your, InfoSec and IT teams, but make sure that it's useful time. It kind of goes that, back in the day, Google had this 15 or 25% of their free time. I can't remember which it was. Was it 15% free time to work on their own thing? Something like that. They had some chunk of time that they could work on whatever they wanted. I'm not saying that. Direct them. But go be proactive in security. Go investigate. Go dig. Go look at things. Go figure stuff out. Figure out how that attaches to that and how this all connects together. And wow, let's go play war game with, let's say one of our suppliers has this lease line connection to us goes bad. What would that do? If you're not able to do that, you're really hurting your long-term viability of coming up with weird pocket cases and how to address them.
Yeah, and I'd say that's becoming a lot more important to do as time goes on, because this, things are getting much more complicated as we see, and at the same time, the opportunity, to be introspective like that is going down, because IT is becoming kind of a race to zero. How can we optimize all of the slack out of the system? And that by itself, I think, is going to cause a lot of problems for the very reasons you just outlined. So good point. Really good point. Our next question is, what security solution do you see companies implementing incorrectly? And to me, it's vulnerability management.
Interesting. Why?
Because I see a lot of companies thinking of vulnerability management in terms of patches. And instead of in terms of vulnerabilities. And that's a really big problem. I mean, hopefully the difference is really obvious, right? But if let's just pick on Heartbleed, and I think I talked about this last week too. If you've got a whole bunch of different pieces of technology, and something like Heartbleed comes out, and you may be vulnerable in a whole lots of different places, but you only have patches for some of the technology. But just because you don't have patches for the other stuff doesn't mean that you're not vulnerable there. And it kind of comes back to you've got to have some kind of a plan to address those vulnerabilities. If you can't patch, just because you can't patch, it doesn't go away. You've still got to deal with it. It gets harder, absolutely.
Yeah, no, I think that's very valid, and I love your point that just because there's not a patch for it from the vendor doesn't mean there isn't a vulnerability. I think that's an absolute key statement. You should put that on bumper sticker.
So what about you?
This is kind of a tough one for me. I think DLC. I think a lot of people have a false sense of security on DLC, and they don't deploy it properly. I would actually lump into here my previous rant of people don't have enough time to monitor their security solutions in general and do the care and feeding. So I think there's a general statement of don't throw a blinky box out there and ignore it. You've got to have the staff to optimize that technology.
Yeah, that's a good one. I don't know that I've ever really seen a well-functioning DLP.
Yeah, sorry, did I say DLC? Yeah, DLP, yes.
See how I did that? That was subtle, wasn't it?
That was very, very slick of you. So yeah, DLP. I'll go with that.
Good.
But I could name so many, right? Firewalls, IPS. There's so many I could name, but we'll go with DLP. I'll put my stake in the ground on that.
I like it. It makes a lot of sense. Wish I had thought that. All right. Next one was Jerry too defeatist about defending against APTs? And so I guess it was probably about 10 episodes back. I was pretty, I guess I was having a weak moment, and I don't necessarily think I'm wrong entirely on this, but I made a comment, something to the effect of, you're not going to stop an advanced adversary like the NSA, and so you shouldn't really count them as your adversary. You need to focus on other more productive things. And I took some heat for that because the point made was, well, you ought to do what you can do, because everything that you do is going to help protect you against other kinds of attacks that aren't necessarily at APT, NSA, China style things. And that's a good point. But I think the reason that I said what I said is, was for a specific purpose, because I see a lot of companies and organizations and whatnot thinking about them, about their risk in terms of how do they protect themselves against, and their data against eavesdropping by the NSA. And I go back to the point that, if the NSA wants to look at your data, they are going to look at your data. And I'm not saying that you should not invest in prudent controls. I'm just saying that the NSA can outspend any company, 100 to 1. I work for a really big company, and their budget is far more big than our entire revenue. So it's just a non-starter. But I don't think that's, my point again wasn't to say that you shouldn't implement prudent controls. It's just that, I think if you're setting yourself to be the ruler of the world, you're probably going to be disappointed. It's not achievable. And you need to have obtainable, reasonable goals. And I just don't think that it's reasonable to expect you're going to keep the NSA or the Chinese government out of your stuff. That's all.
So I had a lot of thoughts on this. So the question was Jerry too defeatist about defending against APT? My answer, no.
Wow. That was deep. All right, moving on. What are the best KRIs to monitor in InfoSec?
Hey, Jerry, what's a KRI?
KRI is a key risk indicator. And
so, for the record, I read this as a key results indicator.
Oh.
which is a management term.
Yeah, no, it's a key risk indicator, and it's
Okay.
it's kind of a COSO, COBIT kind of a thing, right? And one of the problems I see with KRIs is that it's like cloud. It can mean so many different things to so many different people, and rightly so. You've got you've got all kinds of different flavors of cloud, and for different circumstances, and I think the same can be said of KRIs. But speaking of COSO has a really great analogy.
Question.
Go ahead.
For those who don't know, what is COSO?
I forget the acronym, but it's anyway. It was a group that came together. I believe it was in the aftermath of the SNL scandal, if I'm not mistaken, that put together a bunch of controls, right? Risk and security controls. So, and anyway, I don't remember.
That's okay. Whenever we throw out acronyms, I like to define or at least give a pointer.
Yep. Nope. Good question. But and anyhow, there's a PDF, and I'll put a link to the PDF out in the show notes. But they have a really great analogy for key risk indicators that I really liked, and that is, consider a restaurant, right? And the restaurant wants obviously to be a going concern, and they want to know ahead of time when their business is going to slow down. And so if you think about what a key risk indicator is intended to do, it is intended to in some way measure and give you some headlights on where your business is going to have problems. And so this COSO analogy is so perfect, right? So again, thinking about the restaurant, the restaurant finds that the people that come, the amount of people that come and eat at their restaurant is a function of how much income or disposable income people have to spend. And they further find that you can tell how much disposable income people have, or you can kind of gauge it based on the price of gas. Because as the price of gas goes up, lots of people have less disposable income. And so what they find is that naturally over the course of time, and it's a leading indicator, right? So it doesn't happen right away, but as the price of gas goes up, eventually, shortly after that, people have less disposable income, and they go out to eat less. So at some point after the gas prices spike, the restaurant's business goes down, and so that gives the restaurant some headlights on a future slowdown in their operations. And so I think that it's difficult to come up with a firm mapping to information security, and that's in fact why COSO doesn't do it themselves, right? And by the way, I've searched, right? There are not a lot of really any great maps of security KRIs, and I think part of the reason is because it's very dependent on your organization. And so, when I think about from an IT security perspective, what are the key risks that you're likely to think about in terms of supporting the really high level strategic objectives of your company? And those strategic objectives are like staying in business and being profitable and, those kinds of things. And so, the risks are things like, my intellectual property being stolen and replicated by some other cheaper producer that steals my secret sauce, and I no longer have a competitive advantage. And how do you then turn that into an indicator? And that's a difficult thing, because it is honestly, it's pretty specific to your organization and to what you've got implemented. And I don't have a great answer for this, and apparently neither does anybody else. I don't see any really great broad-based advice on developing KRIs. So, for other listeners, if you have, I'd be interested in hearing, what has your organization done? We'll keep your stuff confidential, but give us some ideas if you have some.
Yeah, sadly, I got nothing on this one.
No, that's fine. And then the last question we have is, how much should organizations rely on fraud controls as part of their InfoSec defenses? And my answer is heavily. Not exclusively, but heavily. And I say that because as these attacks in general become more and more sophisticated, the only time that you're actually going to start catching some of these is at the fraud, what I would call, think about it. I like to think about this in terms of the credit card industry, right? They are very focused in the US at least on fraud detection. And they're pretty good, right? They invest in that, and they can detect credit card fraud, whether that credit card fraud came as a result of, somebody skimming cards at McDonald's, or the Target hack, or, something else. It doesn't matter to them. They kind of catch it all. And, there's lots of different permutations of how it can come to be, but that is an effective solution. So, you have to kind of judge based on what you're trying to protect. It may not be reasonable to rely that heavily on fraud controls based on the profile of your organization, or it may make sense that, that is where you should be investing most of your money. It's just very dependent on your specific organization. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's highly dependent on the organization. I like the concept of fraud controls because I think it can catch both intentional and unintentional insider threat, and hijacked insider threat, if that's a term, right? Where the bad guys have taken over somebody's credentials. So, But I think it's such a company-specific question, and that's the challenge with InfoSec, right? There is no one right, perfect answer. It really depends about your organization, your risks, your threats, your needs, and what you consider important. So, but I think, and fraud, by the way, fraud controls can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But in general, I like the concept, right? It's looking at, in essence, behavior or patterns of behavior for anomalies, which I'm a big fan of. Not saying it's a perfect solution, but I think anomaly detection is a better fundamental approach than just a blacklist. But it's not perfect by any means.
Right. Yeah, and it's not comprehensive. I mean, I don't think we should be throwing out our firewalls in favor of antivirus of fraud controls. But I think the point is that you can't get that business process view without the fraud controls, because that's what it's really intended to look at. And we saw last week with the attack on the hedge fund and the inset about the attack on the insurance company. That's probably going to become more and more common, and it's the fraud controls that are going to catch those things. And it's also going to catch a lot of less important things. So I think to me, fraud controls are very important, but as you pointed out, is with many other things, fraud controls mean very different things to very different people, so your mileage may vary.
Indeed.
So that takes us to the end. If you have any more questions for us, please send us an email to info@defensivesecurity.org. We would we'll be happy to compile some questions and then have another Q&A in a couple of weeks or whenever we get enough. If you want to find the show in the show notes, you go to www.defensivesecurity.org. You'll find links to all the stories that we talked about tonight and back episodes and whatnot. If you like the show, go on iTunes and give us a couple of stars or a review. That's always appreciated. You can follow the show on Twitter at DefensiveSec. You can follow Mr. Kellett on Twitter at Lurg and me on Twitter at MaliciousLink. And with that, we will talk to you again next week. Take care.
Good night.
Bye-bye.